Welcome back to New 303. This is Saints or Wizards Part 3. So, in the last part, we spent some time establishing the special cultural role of shamanism, particularly in terms of its gatekeeping of states, altered states, and gatekeeping in the sense of being, keeper sharing, obviously, but as members of the group, right, shamans have the widest sort of state space, typically speaking, as well as the largest vocabulary, the greatest cognitive flexibility, all these things we discussed. And we talked about some of the specifics of this. We also brought in the relatively important additional cognitive dimension of the construal level, which is to say the continuum from Gestalt, which is the forest, to featural, which is the trees. And we left off a little bit with the shamanic idea of soul flight. So I want to expand this particular sort of root of the tree that ends up yielding both the mystic and the magical in terms of psychotechnologies. And to underline it, we really are going to explore this in terms of psychotechnologies, right? Specific psychotechnologies, and both their ability to influence cognition, but also importantly for our purposes, right? Their ability to use altered states, combined altered states to do self-exploration and self-expansion, to make contact with the unconscious in various ways. Okay, so soul flight is a very nearly universal feature, as we mentioned, of shamanic description, this ability to step between worlds, to separate from one's body, right? To journey into the spirit world, to bargain with things. If we were taking a fully naturalistic view of this and making the assumption that there isn't some kind of immaterial body flying out, it would seem as though this was a fairly powerful inner visionary experience. And why is that significant for our purposes? Well, you can obviously see with the emphasis that we've been placing on altered states thus far and hallucination, but also with the dissociative framework that we've been putting into place, right, around the notion of breaking down the unitive bias, that at the intersection of these things rests the potential, right, of being able to, in a deliberate fashion, induce a state which allows you to interact in a person-like fashion with various components of your own mind, right? To pass into an inner space. And some people find that, a sort of strange or far-fetched notion. But of course, if you compare dream, for instance, right, a space that most people have relatively regular and remembered access to, people have striking experiences of this kind quite regularly. And we know, of course, from records that various kinds of psychoactives and also sort of technologies of ritual drumming, et cetera, can induce similarly powerful states. Now, one of the big differences is that in most cases, those states are relatively uncontrolled. But one of the things that I want to propose here is that with a framework of specific skills, and particularly a certain kind of interpersonal skill for bargaining with the irrational, certain kind of interpersonal skill for bargaining with the irrational, and repeated exposure to the states in question, that the shamanic traditions would have learned to navigate these spaces in a way that's quite different than the average person who might be thrust into it casually. Now, as a bit of comparison before we sort of continue into the question of soul flight, consider, and this is obviously anecdotal, but consider, the sort of person who, smokes fairly large quantities of cannabis or otherwise ingests them regularly, right? Versus a person who perhaps is having a strong dose for their first time, right? It's very easy to recognize that the person who's having a strong dose for the first time is really knocked off kilter. They're knocked off balance, right? They may, classically spend the entire experience, laughing uproariously in a somewhat uncontrolled fashion, right? In general, they're going to find it quite overwhelming. But a person who becomes a chronic habitual user, right, is capable of sort of navigating both the space, right, the alterations, but also the world, right? They can compensate for the distortions in various ways. Similarly, I want to propose that, of course, while the novel state space of a particular visionary altered state, as we might see in cases like this, initially speaking, is likely to be exceedingly overwhelming, that indeed there are sort of specialized, there is the repetition and the opportunity to build skill through repetition, but there is also a specialized set of skills. And one of those skills, very importantly, when what we're talking about is making contact with sort of our inner machinery, right? And the quasi-autonomous dynamics of our own mind. There is a kind of interpersonal approach to this that in fact would be highly advantageous. And so we're going to come back around to this idea, but I want to foreground that a little bit, that if one is entering a state where they are making contact with the sort of quasi-autonomous agents, right? They're semi-agents. I mean, they're not completely separated out from your cognitive functioning, but they are dissociated enough from your sort of core conscious complex that they have a fair bit of seeming autonomy, right? Bargaining with those things is not the same as having a conversation with a regular person. There is a certain irrationality often that accompanies them, but there are nevertheless rules to interactions. And I want to propose that in many ways, this is akin to the sorts of general rules that one finds in various traditional indigenous shamanic spiritual systems for interacting with spirits and gods. Right? That there are very often culture-bound rules about how one goes about interacting them, how to frame this. And while those rules may not be sort of rationally coherent in the way that we would think of, talking to another person, they have their own internal consistency and their own utility in doing this sort of thing. So we're going to unpack that idea as we go. But in the meantime, I want to talk about soul flight. Now, one of the reasons I want to talk about it, aside from its ubiquity, is the way that it has filtered out from its sort of original shamanic roots. As we start to see sort of organized religion developing in various parts of the world, shamanism is typically, to a significant extent, marginalized. It is in some cases syncretized with organized religion. And so there are interesting cases, for instance, Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism. Right? There is a strain of sort of shamanistic magical practice that goes quite far back in Tibet. And when Buddhism arrives with a relatively sophisticated sort of set of its own psychotechnologies and metaphysics and such, rather than being completely pushed out, it ends up sort of merging itself with this other tradition. And Vajrayana is a flowering of that. Vajrayana notably, right, compared to sort of other Buddhisms, is considerably sort of magical in some sense in its orientation. So, for instance, right, in virtually every other form of Buddhism, every other Buddhism, people are counseled that as they pursue sort of self-discipline, spiritual self-discipline, and as they develop their meditative acumen, right, as they develop their meditative powers, that they are likely to see sort of supernatural abilities as a side effect. These siddhis, right, which are sort of widely covered in the literature in various ways, can range all over the place, right? Person may be able to apparently find themselves in more than one place at the same time, or shrink to a point, or, there are all sorts of things. So there are all sorts of sort of these powers that are described, but the sort of orthodox doctrine in most of the other Buddhisms is that although these siddhis may spontaneously arise in the course of developing one's powers of concentration and contemplation, they should be disregarded. They're a distraction. They're just sort of more maya, more illusion, right? So that would tend to be, for most Buddhisms, the kind of orthodox answer. The answer is that if these siddhis arise, you should disregard them. They're a distraction. This is not so in some of the Vajrayana schools, which sort of adapt their particular Northern Indian tantric elements together with some of these shamanistic and magical elements to produce something where, indeed, in some strains of tantric Vajrayana, the development of siddhis is taken as a sign of spiritual advancement, right? They are taken, in fact, as a marker that you are getting someplace. So in some cases, right, like in Tibet and in a few other locations, these shamanic traditions end up meshing themselves into more organized religions. A lot of the time they're marginalized, but nevertheless, there is typically a common substrate. And the common substrate is that as the sort of master of altered states within within sort of a culture area, right, the shaman finds the specific sort of role and utility within that culture in those things like trance. Now, we've already talked a little bit about trance, and trance is sometimes used as a means of entering a visionary state. Trance is sometimes used as a means of sort of achieving a state of divination, right? Achieving sort of information supernaturally, either through consultation with the spirit world or perhaps reading a divination task. Trance is occasionally used to sort of enter a state where one can shrug off sort of physical exhaustion, right? So it's used to sort of continue ritual action, drumming, dancing, etc., for long periods, and so on and so forth. However, trance also, quite importantly, is relatively frequently used to channel a kind of intentional state of possession, right? To allow a spirit creature or a god or the ancestral dead, right, to allow an incorporeal being of some kind to temporarily occupy one's body and speak through them. And I've already drawn the connection back to the experiments using sort of hypnotic induction to create artificial states of possession and artificial states of dissociative identity. So I want you to get a sense of there being a kind of continuum here. However, insofar as this visionary state goes and the launching of sort of the soul from the body in this soul flight state, this is of specific interest to us. Now, that kind of, intense visualization, which is spatialized, is something that we really do see turn up, okay? And we see it turn up in the organized religions as well, right? It is notable, for instance, right? Some people have made the comparison to Muhammad's night flight. And there are a number of instances of this, right? Figures in various organized religions who are sort of suddenly transported through a spiritual vista to make contact with various kinds of supernatural powers or see the world from above. So it's a common theme even in organized religion. It is likewise a theme that we actually see play through early Western philosophy. And that primarily seems to come, at least initially in its line, through Pythagoras. Pythagoras is a curious figure to a significant extent within sort of the Greek historical canon. So Pythagoras was not sort of a proper Greek in some sense. So he came down from Thracia, from Thrace, and likewise was trained there. Okay, and for the sensibilities of sort of the various Greek city-states and peoples, Pythagoras stood out as very odd. So for one thing, the Greeks had something of a bias, right? They believed that the taller you were, the thicker your skull was, and therefore the smaller your brain was, and the stupider you were, right? This plays into their idea of barbarians, barbaroi, those who don't speak Greek. So here are these various sort of European peoples who they think of as being enormous, or right, peoples from other regions around them they think of as being really big and therefore really dumb. Pythagoras, unfortunately, bucked this trend for them because he was very tall and also brilliant. Pythagoras was sort of the first professional teacher within the Western canon, which is to say that his only job was to teach people. And he is noted for his ability to sort of teach anything to anyone. So he had this tremendous sort of flexibility in the way that he presented and explained things. And, consider for a second that prior to this, it's not that there weren't people teaching things, but there were no people who were just teachers. Pythagoras is the first person on record in the West as just a teacher. There are other strangenesses. So Pythagoras was noted for constantly wearing sort of a laurel and like a ceremonial white garment, basically. So this would be sort of akin to if you knew somebody who insisted on wearing a tuxedo every single day. So that's odd. And it was well known in some sense among his contemporaries that Pythagoras had sort of entered the path of philosophy, right, of philosophia, after his initiation into the mysteries of Thrace, the Thracian mysteries. Those Thracian mysteries included, among other things, the Thunderstone Rite. The Thunderstone Rite, in which Pythagoras was sealed into a cave for 3 days. So here we see a tomb, of course, as living burial. We see this tomb theme. We see this buried alive, sensory deprivation, etc. Right? This sort of prefigures a number of things, but it's very shamanic in its outlines, and that's kind of noted. These were sort of shamanic traditions that remained in Thrace. And among other things, he was taught soul flight. So he's the first person talking about it in the Western philosophical canon, talking about his ability to, right, cause his soul to leave his body so that he could see the view from above. And this is something that gets a continuous mention, actually, for hundreds of years. It seems in many cases to have been flagged, and I'm indebted here to the brain skipped a beat. I'm indebted to the philosophical writings of Pierre Hadot, who wrote, among other things, Philosophy as a Way of Life, as a sort of an excellent book in digging into how we ought to think about certain kinds of philosophical traditions in contrast to the sort of analytical argumentation-based method that we typically apply to it in the modern era. So I'm indebted somewhat to Hadot. So there were these continuous mentions of this sort of soul flight, the idea of soul flight, and then it seems to somewhat peter out in the Western tradition, right? However, it's noteworthy that it's there. And in some of those accounts, as well as in the shamanic accounts that we see some relatively consistent features turning up in these accounts. So obviously there is this otherworldly space, but often there is a kind of worldly quality to it. Now, what can we say about the worldly quality? Well, it's got that view from above. It's got this rising above, right, very high up, being able to see things, okay? Interesting. And then also, we note that it very frequently passes into a space which is either on the threshold to the spirit world or, right, certainly inflected by it, which is to say it takes on a dreamlike or symbolic quality, right? Things take on a greater degree of meaning. Things are highly meaningful and signify for things. Okay, so how should we think about this day? And this is where I want to point you to, if I may. This is where I want to point you back to our friend, this diagram. Okay, why? So if we consider this kind of increased degree of signification that's happening, right? This increased degree of signification, things standing in for other things, a kind of fluency in meaning, then what we're talking about is increased transparency. And if what we're talking about when we're talking about rising up and being able to see things sort of in their entirety, being able to take the long view, the view from above, then what we're talking about is the Gestalt. So what I want to propose is that soul flight, effectively speaking, is a kind of prototypical trance-based altered state that is designed to push people way up into this top right-hand corner, right? Sort of the thrust point between Gestalt and transparency. Okay. Now, this is something we're going to cover off at greater length because I want to try to show that there are a variety of kind of motions in this particular space, and we'll add sort of more dimensions to this as we go. But they're kind of motions within the space that are actually quite central. So in this respect, I owe portions of this argument to my friend and colleague, John Vervaeke, and to our friend and colleague, Leo Ferraro, who talked about some of this material. So this kind of soul flight moving out of your body, right, and taking this very high level Gestalt with an increased degree of signification is up in the top right-hand corner of this chart. Now, we'll come back around to certain sort of additional components of shamanism. But one of the things that transitions essentially speaking, shamanism into some of the more contemporary, even if pre-axial religions, is the development of another particular psychotechnology, which is to say one we've already discussed at length, literacy. The development of literacy is one of the things that serves to transition. We see it developing in a number of places, and at the same time, we start to see sort of larger settlements and sort of larger general human groups. And with that, the beginning of what we would think of as sort of more conventional organized religion, a less sort of distributed and decentralized shamanic tradition, and a more sort of centralized religion. Now, as I mentioned, there are cases where that centralized religion does import many of the original qualities. So as I mentioned previously, the Aztecs had a distinctly sort of shamanic quality to their royalty, who were also their sort of chief religious figures, right? So there was a sort of broad set of intersecting factors there. But for the most part, what we see is conventionalized religions beginning to supersede. And one of the reasons for this is very clearly literacy. Now, literacy off the bat, we've already mentioned that it remarkably expands our cognitive capacities in various ways, right? I am capable of plucking a book off of a shelf and, essentially speaking, making telepathic contact with somebody who may have died decades, centuries, or millennia ago. Right? I can read the thoughts of those people, right? Is it sort of perfect contact? No, it requires interpretation and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, despite that, right, I am able to make contact with these things. Famously, Lao Tzu, the sort of founder in some sense of Taoism, when he was migrating away from the Middle Kingdom, was stopped at the border by the guard, who wanted him to, write something down. And he's like, no, there's no point. And the guard is like, please, like, before you leave, write something down. This story is almost certainly apocryphal, but nevertheless illustrative. And Lao Tzu's response is, no, books are the lees and scum of dead men. But the guard implores upon him, and finally Lao Tzu ends up penning the Tao Te Ching, right, which of course is one of the sort of great classics and the sort of foundational text in some sense of Taoism. But this idea, books of the lees and scum of dead men, this is the pushback. However, it is nevertheless the case that obviously countless people have received a certain amount of structuring wisdom, inspiration, aspiration, right, from reading the Tao Te Ching. That quality of text to allow us to connect with other minds who may be quite distant from us in space and time is remarkable. It is also remarkable, right, that the power of literacy extends not just to other people, but in a sense to ourselves, provides us with a certain kind of continuity. So if you've done journaling, one of the things about it is that you can go back and read your own thoughts. And that normal quality that thoughts have, where they are ephemeral, right? What you think and what you feel and the quality and texture of your day blows away like a handful of powdered spice in the wind for the most part. And we're left with imperfect, reconstructed, constantly shuffling, right? And shifting sets of memories about things. And yet, to the extent that we employ literacy to journal, we can go back and we can get a far more direct access to that moment. This can enable us both, obviously, to see how much we may have changed, how much we've stayed the same, how often things are occurring to us. There are patterns that we can detect that we would not otherwise detect. This is all quite remarkable. Now, it was sort of no big secret that writing was considered, in fact, to be deeply, deeply important and magical in the periods after its development. It is not a coincidence that in many religious traditions, the god who is associated with magic primarily is also the god of writing, right? That tends to be a kind of dual quality. The god who is associated with writing is the god who's associated with magic. And after we begin to emerge from this kind of more earthbound and naturalist, right, kind of shamanic period, we begin more and more to associate magic and the practice of magic to a significant extent with texts. So importantly, right, when we say that somebody, won a spelling bee or won a spelling contest, right, spelling is the same, precisely the same root as spell, to cast a spell. So you spelled that wrong is literally, right, to cast a spell. Similarly, the word grammar, right, to talk about the grammar of a language is cognate with the word grimoire, where grimoire is literally like a book of magical spells, right? A grimoire, this is a name for a book of magical spells. So grammar and grimoire are developed from this thing. This is a pretty well situated and firm association that most cultures have, this association between writing and magic. Now, the idea that writing had these sort of supernatural qualities, and that indeed, right, for many cultures that have it early on, right, having somebody's name written down was in itself a kind of magical link. If you could write somebody's name down and affect that charm on paper, that was, deemed to have sort of magical properties. We do know that in addition to sort of the time binding properties that writing seems to have, there are other interesting sort of psychotechnological effects that we perceive depending on systems of writing. So for instance, if a writing system is read from left to right versus from right to left, if a writing system is read from left to right, it tends to privilege and emphasize left-brain thinking. So it will increase, right? And we talked before about the sort of the Navon letter, right? The S composed of tiny H's, where you can shift between the Gestalt and the featural levels of construal. Well, similarly, simply reading left to right over and over again will tend to emphasize left brain thinking, which for at least 90% of the population is going to tend to drive them towards the featural. Reading right to left has a small but significant sort of counter effect. Right? So if you read from right to left, you're going to tend to see increased right brain emphasis. Moreover, the specific structure of your language can have a remarkable effect on your sort of construal level, right? And obviously, the more processing you do in a particular sort of range of the construal level, the more developed and differentiated your abilities in that domain are likely to become neuroplastically. So as an example, okay, by the time we start to introduce, sort of the precursor scripts of what we would think of, today with Romanized script, we have a pretty set sort of formula. It's alphabetic, which is to say that, right, there are specific sounds associated with specific letters, and there's a very limited subset of letters, as opposed to languages where there are many, many characters. So there's a limited subset of letters, and the letters come in two forms: consonants and vowels. Well, interestingly, we can look at a counterpoint, a system that likewise has limited sounds, but doesn't possess vowels, which is to say Hebrew. Now, the interesting thing about Hebrew as opposed to a vowel producing language, right? And think about when we thought about the cat, right? There being a paradox present in that, because we had to simultaneously have a top-down, right? A top-down imposition of the Gestalt, but also a bottom-up sensing of the features, and seemingly each one relied on the other, and that was an impossibility unless we think of this as existing in an opponent process, right? So there's a kind of tug of war happening where they're both simultaneously attempting to solve the problem, and boom, you can read. A language like Hebrew that has no vowels in it, right, therefore forces you to do more contextual reading, right? In order to figure out what a word is, right, minus the vowels, you only have the consonant sounds to go on. And that means that you have to take in a much wider context in order to figure out what that word would be. So think about that element. And you can think about it relative to other languages too, right? Character-driven languages, where a single character may in fact mean a vast number of things, right, is going to be in no small part contextually determinable. You're going to have to consider context in a much, much larger fashion. You're going to have to consider the Gestalt, broaden out to the Gestalt. Because, well, imagine we come across the Hebraic English word, and the word is CT. Okay, so is that word cat, caught, cut? How do we know? Well, if we read the surrounding material, then we're probably going to localize whether it's cat, caught, or cut, right? Three pretty different words. So the simple lack of vowels requires a broadening out into the gestalt. You have to take more context into account in order to process. In contrast, however, right, an alphabet that works with vowels, right, as English, for instance, does, although poorly, since English has so many weird loopholes of pronunciation and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, right, you can look at these precursors in sort of Greek and eventually into the Romanized scripts, right, where the thing is that you really have to read the letters and you've got to figure them out like in sequence. There's a certain amount of scrambling that you can do, which is to say, I'm sure most of you have seen this experiment where as long as you keep the first and last letter intact, you can rearrange the letters in the middle and it's still quite readable for you, right? Which is a spooky and weird experience, right? Unless, of course, you're aware of these two levels operating on language. However, nevertheless, you do require all the letters to disambiguate it. Therefore, it's very featurally driven. You need the letters to know what's being said, right? So aside from the qualities of these languages in terms of direction of reading, driving your construal level by focusing you in one direction or another, the languages themselves are constructed in such a way as they play with your construal level, right? And therefore are going to tend to drive, by the very nature of them, certain kinds of processing. Okay, so language has this binding quality, right? It's central to the development of religion, but it also becomes quite central to sort of magic practice, right? As we begin to see the practices of magic emerge. So what is the sort of next psychotechnology that we see emerging out of this, right? There are a bunch of psychotechnologies that are all historically developed at about this time. So currency is one of these, right? Basically money. And the sort of numerical sophistication that goes with certain systems of money, right? So debt becomes abstracted and debt becomes money and so on and so forth, right? So money is a psychotechnology of abstract exchange. Okay, fine. But the next one that sort of really slots into this space of psychotechnological, altered state motion is mindfulness. And mindfulness, okay, when you take up a mindfulness practice, you first learn concentration, right? Generally speaking, you first learn concentration. You fix your attention on a candle flame and you continue to do so, right? In a mode of soft focus rather than hard attention, right? Or soft vigilance rather than hard focus. The point is that you learn how to hold your attention in one place, which is a remarkably difficult thing to do, but it can certainly be learned with practice. You learn how to hold your attention in one place. Then once you do, you take that ability to hold your attention and you begin to turn it inwards to various things. There are lots of different forms of meditation that existed in India prior to sort of mindfulness, which we specifically associate with Buddhism. And these forms of attention often were devoted to attaining states of consciousness which involved various degrees of merger and sort of dissolution of boundary, right? Dissolution of non-duality, et cetera. So, holding a meditative degree of focus and attention on a candle flame, right, long enough that you begin to feel that the candle flame has expanded to fill your awareness, right? Or that you indeed have become the candle flame, right? It becomes sort of a sole object within your consciousness, is one of these very clear markers that you turn up in meditative systems, and not just in the Indian subcontinent. You see things like that turn up all over the place, right? A kind of merger. Then there is sort of a state of merging with the world, right? And then perhaps even dropping that away and having a, sort of a complete state of cosmic merger. Mindfulness is an interesting innovation in this respect because rather than attempting to expand and to dissolve, right? So to expand one's consciousness out and dissolve out the state of non-duality and differentiation. Instead, mindfulness pulls the attention back to a kind of minimally self-referential loop. So the idea is to constantly catch when your mind is going off track, okay, but then also to focus on the breath in a way that is gradually emptying the content out from your consciousness. And how do you do this, right? Well, traditionally speaking, you focus on the breath, right? So the rising and falling of your chest, and the cool of the air as it enters your nostrils and the warm of the air as it leaves. Now, there are various kinds of supporting things that can be done, right? Posture, of course, is very important. And right, there are lots of things that can sort of support this breathing practice and being centered in the breathing practice. But the basic is bringing your now, relatively speaking, trained attention down to this particular level, which is to say, right, you want to bring it down to a very minimal set of sensory experiences, very minimal set of minimum sensory experiences. And you don't want to let your mind engage in elaboration. You don't want your mind to suddenly start signifying. Now, if you think about this, right, this is basically saying that what you're doing is you're driving your mind down to the bottom left-hand corner, right? The bottom left-hand corner of this chart, opacity and featural. The very specific feature, the small scale feature that you're focusing on, of course, is sensation of the breath. It's very minimal and it's specific and it's concrete and it's sensory, right? And it's over on the opacity side, right? Because you very specifically don't want it to signify. You don't want your mind to be elaborating on the meaning of this. You just want to be pulling your attention really minimally. Now, interestingly, the thing that typically pairs immediately after, right, you manage to get your basic mindfulness practice down is that you practice metta. And metta, of course, is an expanding wave of signification where you wish health and well-being to an expanding circle of beings, right? First, your loved ones, then people who you are neutral and indifferent towards, right? Then perhaps somebody that is an enemy or who has a beef with you, there's negative feeling, and gradually outwards until you encompass all conscious beings or perhaps all beings, period, right? Sometimes under the notion that all existent things are effectively sentient. And so thus you can sort of expand your wave of compassion to fill the entire universe. Well, that practice of metta is without question pushing, right, your cognition in the direction of the gestalt and the transparent. So here is a paired set of practices, right, that we see turning up, which is in an opponent process fashion, going to be training up your cognitive flexibility. It's going to train up your cognitive flexibility, your ability to move between these states. And we see the precursor of that in this very important sense in soul flight, right? Now, metta is a very channeled state, okay? But this kind of soul flight notion, where you are moving into a state of, increased transparency, increased gestalt, massive signification, and, right, simultaneously combining that together with the kinds of trance states which are likely to induce a kind of dissociation, right, which allows regions that are normally tightly integrated, right, to become partly differentiated and semi-autonomous. Combine those two things together, and all of a sudden, you're moving out into a space that is filled with semi-autonomous sovereign powers with their own interests, their own observations, and frankly, their own concerns, desires, emotional positions, et cetera, et cetera. All that is, as you'll see, remarkably consistent with what we practically see on the ground when we are engaged in therapy. So we'll talk, well, what the hell, let's talk about it now. Let's talk about it now briefly. So I want to talk a little bit about chair work, okay? We are going to come back to psychotechnologies, but this is as good a place as any. So let's talk a little bit about chair work. Okay, chair work is it's a Gestalt therapy technique. Although it's funny, anyway, that's not a direct relation, but chair work is a Gestalt therapy technique. It's been taken up by a number of other therapeutic systems. When I learned chair work, I learned it as part of my training in EFT, emotion-focused therapy. And EFT is one of these sort of post-CBT therapeutic systems that was constructed really on the basis of sort of like as much empirical evidence as they could provide. So the system essentially was constructed by looking at therapists who had a relatively high success rate, filming their therapeutic interactions and going through them with a fine-toothed comb, time coding all of the various interactions, techniques, methods, et cetera, to basically see whether or not certain techniques were sort of effective, what markers they could see in terms of the patient, the client, right, displaying certain things and what that meant relative to the effectiveness of certain kinds of techniques. So it was really constructed with a kind of reflective scrutiny, okay, over the process. I add a reflective scrutiny made possible by video, right, which you can see a bit of an echo to the reflective scrutiny made possible through literacy, right, as a kind of psychotechnology, right? So the possibility of being able to videotape oneself and observe it is something, of course, that we're still seeing the knock-on effects of in our culture. But in any event, that's how EFT was constructed. And one of the techniques which was promptly incorporated because it was shown to be so significant is chair work. So there are two forms of chair work: two chair work and empty chair work. They are somewhat similar, okay, but reflect slightly different sort of goals and processes therapeutically. So in two chair work, okay, the therapist is working with the client, and two chair work is specifically about dealing with internal fractures, okay? It's dealing with internal fractures. In EFT, this is called a split. So splits that one might notice when they were talking to a client, right, include, say, a self-critical split, right, where the client is talking about something and all of a sudden they sort of pause and cut themselves off and say something really harsh, right? There is a sense that there's a split within their consciousness where something intrudes to criticize them, right? So this is a self-critical split. Another that one might track is a self-interruptive split. So the client is going on all of something suddenly basically cuts them off and they stop, right? So these are the sorts of things that you track. You look for these sort of splits as markers that might tell you that you need to do two chair work. In two chair work, what you basically do is you as the therapist are sitting sort of apart, I guess, in a third chair, and you have the client in one chair facing another chair, okay? And what they are instructed to do basically is to put themselves, so they themselves, the client, are in the one chair. In the facing chair, they put the split. So let's say they put their self-critical split, okay? So they put this split. And then they move, you direct them as a therapist to move over into that chair, okay? And to speak on behalf of the self-critical split, to then imagine themselves sitting in the other chair, and they say, right, whatever critical things they're going to say, right? So they speak for the self-critical split. Okay, then you shift them back into the first chair, back into their regular sort of experiencing self, and you have them respond emotionally to what the self-critical split has said, right? Basically to tell it how this has made them feel, these kinds of criticisms, which are often very harsh. And so they tell it. Then you shift them back into the other chair and you allow the self-critical split to respond, and so on and so forth. And as you shift them back between these positions, for one thing, I mean, I'm making this sound relatively sanitized, and it isn't. When you actually start putting people through this technique, there's typically a certain degree of resistance off the bat, because, I mean, it's strange, right? You're talking to yourself across two chairs. It's an unusual experience if you haven't engaged it. That's precisely how I felt when I was training in it, because to train it, we had to do it, right? We had to participate in it, and it felt initially awkward. However, what that doesn't quite capture is the extent to which this really unlocks extremely powerful emotions for people. Often they find it quite surprising. And admittedly, I also found it quite surprising when I first started doing this work. I had initially speaking failed to see how it was distinct from other kinds of imaginal parts work techniques. Why the chair? Basically, like, what is the chair doing? Like, why do we need that? Why can't we just, right, use imagination or use discussion or use, right? Nevertheless, this is an extremely powerful experience for people. I have had cases with clients where more or less on taking up the position, of the self-critical split, people immediately like burst into tears, right? And often in a tremendous cathartic release, in many cases, something that they had been otherwise unable to do, right? But the real goal, of course, is to have this back and forth between the person and their split, so that as you repeatedly tell the split how it's making them feel, it shifts its position around. And what you typically find is, of course, that the split is actually attempting to help them. It's just doing so in a slightly distorted or out of date way. It's trying to help them, right? It's for their own good. Is usually the sort of opening line. And gradually what you see in this exchange, if you're sort of doing it, is that you see a softening. The softening happens where you can come to a new relationship with this thing. It stops hectoring you, stops torturing you, right? If you're seeing shades here of the technique of sort of hypnotic psychosynthesis that we talked about earlier, or if you're seeing shades of the Japanese soldier, that's not coincidental. And this is one of the things that I sort of want to point out. There is a shared set of assumptions that runs through a bunch of psychotherapeutic techniques that are quite effective, right? That if we look at them closely, rest on a similar set of presuppositions in a way to many of these traditional psychotechnologies, right? It's just that the language of explanation is different, right? We have a distinct language of explanation. Okay, briefly on the other side of chair work, and then I want to jump back. So the other side of chair work is empty chair work. Empty chair work is about other people, not interior to oneself, and it's about unfinished business. So one does empty chair work when, for whatever reason, somebody has unfinished business, your client has unfinished business with another person, and for whatever reason, they can't resolve it directly. It might be that the other person has died. It might be that they're estranged. It might be that they're, right, they don't know where they are. Or it may just be that they're sort of too blocked, or they feel that the conversation is impossible to have, right? Any of those conditions can cause this kind of unfinished business. And so in this case, what you're doing is you project that other person into the chair, right? So here they are, they're experiencing self. They witness in the direction of the chair, and they imagine the person, right? Ideally, right, in a kind of full body way, they imagine what they would be wearing, and most importantly, they imagine their facial expression. And then you tell them what you want to hear, and they respond. Sometimes you do a bit of client switching there too, right? You put the client into the other chair and let them respond as the other person, but not necessarily. Often you can keep them on the one side, and the empty chair just sort of talks back to them. Again, this is the sort of thing that seems strange and kind of implausible until you actually do it. And the effect, if it's done reasonably skillfully, is remarkable. It's very powerful, right? Now, as I mentioned, in both of these cases, I was initially puzzled. Like, why should the chair make any difference at all? And yet it seemingly did. And this got me thinking to a great extent about the way that imagining somebody in the chair, right, imagining in this way, sort of allows you to accept, in a sense, the spatializing areas of your brain, right? You're making use of space as a way of separating, right? You're telling your brain in this very important symbolic sense, like, no, I'm over here, it's over there, right? The projecting outside of oneself to have a conversation is a powerful technique for trying to separate something out, right, in precisely this way, to put it in front of you, to sort of summon it in front of you so that you can have a conversation, right? Okay, so hold that idea. Okay. Now, as we already mentioned, okay, when we start to get mindfulness pulling in this direction, and we start to get metta pulling in this direction, we see something that is quite akin, in a certain sense, right, to numerous systems, okay, numerous systems that we see religiously. It is a weird, it's a weird irony that in the West, the words contemplation and meditation have basically completely reversed their meanings. So contemplation and meditation used to mean the opposite. So we think of meditation as being like right? Meditation is this state of quiet or sort of emptiness or whatever. Meditation used to mean, right, to hold a thought in your mind, right? You would meditate upon something, to have an object of thought that you were kind of rolling around. Contemplation, on the other hand, used to be this state of sitting in a sort of quiet and minimal state of emptiness, often preparatory to prayer. And instead, it has taken on the modern meaning of being like, oh, I'm contemplating, like I'm thinking about things. So these two words basically have reversed meanings. They swapped meanings at some point. If you read the history of English, it's very, very strange. So there are lots of those sorts of things. Okay, so we have this sort of basic set of technologies, which is, we use prayer or chant, different kinds of religious technologies to train the attention in certain ways in the pursuit of altered states. And very often, if you look closely at the body of meditative and contemplative exercises that are in use, you'll see some set of things that are either dragging the mind towards a kind of minimal state, which is to say opaque and featural, or expanding the mind out, right, in a meta or soul flight-like fashion in the direction of the gestalt and the transparent. So this is something we see crop up all over the place. Now, when we look at this on the magical side of the equation, we find a few really interesting things, and they're interlinked in a sense, especially in the West, with sort of the pre-scientific view of knowledge creation. Okay, so the pre-scientific view of knowledge creation was considerably less focused on causality. Within modern scientific frameworks, we're very concerned with causality, right? Aristotle was concerned with causality. This sort of inspired Newton and a bunch of the other people. We tend to think in terms of cause and effect as the primary way of understanding something, right? This is sort of Kant's elucidation of how science works. You backtrace a set of effects through their causes so that you can find the original cause. And that's what you're supposed to be doing in science. However, in the period before that, the primary method of knowledge creation was not by causality, but rather by association, right? It was rather by association. So the idea was that the world was constructed, in a sense, analogically. And we're going to talk next class about the distinction between the logical and the analogical, and why these particular things, frankly, are confusing in the appreciation of certain kinds of things like art and poetry and so forth, this confusion between the logical and the analogical. So we're going to talk about the logical and the analogical, but the point is it's analogical. Essentially speaking, right, this notion of knowledge creation during the period was about acausal association. You tended to try to read the world like a text. Things meant other things, right? So you could see sort of, if you consider notions like omens, right? The idea that there might be an omen, that a set of birds flies overhead in the sky. Well, in interpreting that, what you're doing is you're attempting to take a real world event and you are transparently going through it, right, as a signifier to attempt to decide something else about the state of the world. The maximally expanded version of this that you get in certain kinds of mystical texts explicitly talks about sort of reading the mind of God, right? So reading the language of God. The idea is that you could push yourself into this deep state where everything began to signify in a particular way, right? The apparent world instead turned out to be a kind of text that could be read for deeper meaning. This sort of general system that we see turn up is what's called the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures. And the idea was that there were sort of a limited number of ruling powers in the world, and thus the world divided into sort of categories under those powers. So this will be a little bit confusing initially speaking, but if we look around in the culture, we actually see the leftovers of this system all over the place. So one good example of this is the zodiac, astrology. If you're familiar with your zodiac sign, with astrology, I mean, you notice they still run that stuff in the newspaper. People talk about it like it's a primary point of contention. The system of zodiac and astrology is explicitly part of the doctrine of signatures, right? There were sort of 12 ruling houses in the sky. That was an important part of the doctrine of signatures. Birthstones. For those of you who are familiar with your birthstone, which is to say a particular stone associated with a month, this is a leftover from the doctrine of signatures. To some extent, there's some leads with the notion of the language of flowers. This is mostly badly decayed, but it used to be the case that you could send a relatively sophisticated message to somebody with a bouquet, right? Each flower stood for a certain kind of thing in a given arrangement and so on and so forth, right? So you could send a message with a bouquet consisting of certain flowers. Now, most of that has fallen apart, but there are specific flowers that we tend to culturally tag for specific things, right? Red roses are very specifically, right, associated typically with kind of romantic love and the intention of romantic love. That's a fragment of the language of flowers. But one of the most striking bits of the doctrine of signatures and the systems of correspondence that it uses that we still have hanging around is playing cards. So playing cards are, of course, right, playing cards, standard playing cards you would see in any, casino or game are, of course, a degenerate form of tarot card. So where the standard playing cards that we're familiar with are sort of squashed, there's a range of numbers, and then there are, trump cards, the jack, the queen, the king, the ace, etc. And we see four suits, right? We see spades and clubs and hearts and diamonds. Each of these has a direct analog to its tarot card predecessor. The difference is that basically they chopped off most of what are called the major arcana, which were sort of individual, unique, symbolic archetypal cards, which rested on top of sort of the numbered cards within suits. And the suits within a tarot deck are wands or staves, which corresponds to clubs, right, and is sort of the working of the fields. Hearts, which corresponds to chalices or cups, right, the suit of cups, and often is associated with sort of the priesthood, right, because the cup of the mass, but also the hearts of the people. Diamonds, or translate to sort of pentacles, coins, or discs, and it's typically associated with the sort of merchant class, right, the coin carrying class, so diamonds, and spades, which corresponds to swords in most instances, and this corresponds to the warrior class. So you can see right away that there is this idea built in, right? The four sort of classes of medieval society in a numerical ranking. There are a bunch of associations. And if you're familiar at all with tarot cards, you know that they're used for sort of divinatory purposes. The inclusion of the major arcana in the tarot card system added an entire additional layer about sort of the relationships and powers of the world. So it was part of this sort of table of correspondence, a system of correspondence within a doctrine of signatures, right? You could, in a sense, right, you could lay cards out in front of you and read them. And if you were in a sort of suitably interpretive frame of mind, right, they became transparent to you. You read through the cards into a deeper meaning. So all of these fragments that are kind of left over of these various systems, they're scattered here and there in the modern world, often deeply compelling for people, but they're left over from this much more integrated and complex system that preceded them, right? So, you would have the world in a sense carved up by powers, as I mentioned, right? So take, for instance, the planet Mars, okay? The planet Mars is associated with the god Mars, who is associated with war, who is associated with the color red, associated with blood, associated with iron, associated in modern magical practice with tobacco, interestingly enough, associated with, right? You can see that there is, associated with the hawk. For each thing, you can take a slice out of the world, in a sense, and find, like, where does Mars attach to this? There's an archetypal quality to it, right? An archetypal quality to it. The power of war, the power of blood, the power of, right, iron. These things all link together. The planet is deemed to be sort of a transparent reference through to this archetypal power, as though there is something sort of outside reality that shows up with all these different objects in the world that can be transparently read through in the way that we read a word to sense the underlying power. Okay, so I've said that once. I'll probably iterate it again because I recognize that for some people that's quite dense. But the idea is that, you have these charts where things are divided into these broad bands, right? Often in a planetary fashion. This is going to differ between cultures. So I'm sort of lingering on the Western version, but every culture is going to have their own carving up. So this isn't sort of an intrinsic feature of the world, right? It's like a language. You have to sort of internalize it and use it self-consistently. But provided that you do so, different languages are perfectly capable of expressing information, even though they use perhaps a different grammar, different vocabulary, et cetera, right? There's no reason why, people speaking Finnish or people speaking, Portuguese or people speaking, Japanese or something can't equally well express a set of thoughts about things. Likewise, these different sort of tables of correspondence that cultures come up with, and most cultures come up with them in some way or another, right? They form a kind of, grid, like a giant spreadsheet that gives you the key to interpreting things within reality. Now, that kind of associative knowledge making was a big part of the medieval project, was specifically trying to assemble these tables of correspondence to support the doctrine of signatures, right? Where magical practice begins to impact on these things, magical practitioners very often were using certain kinds of trance techniques, not dissimilar to things like soul flight, and certain kinds of ritual and invocation techniques in order to be able to navigate through the systems of correspondence in a particular kind of way, to navigate through them. Okay, so what does that mean? So Umberto Eco has a term for this. He calls it hermetic drift. There was this idea that you could, in a sense, right, skim along from one meaning to another, to another, to another, right? So that you could connect things together at great length in your mind. That this was a kind of altered state of unlimited semiosis, if any of you are into semiotics, a state of unlimited semiosis that you could enter into, but you could do so in a relatively deliberate fashion. So, trying to think here. If any of you have ever played, okay, there's a Wikipedia game, right, where you are given an initial Wikipedia page, and then you are given a target Wikipedia page, and you're supposed to get there in a small number of clicks, right? As small a number of clicks as possible. So the idea is you get a random Wikipedia page, and then you have some place you're supposed to go to. Okay, this is akin to another game that you may have played where you click the first link in a Wikipedia page and eventually it will ground out. And fascinatingly, a very large number of Wikipedia pages eventually bottom out at the page philosophy. So if you just click the first link in every one, eventually they bottom out in philosophy, which is interesting. However, this game is like you've got a starter page and an end page, and you're supposed to basically go through the page clicking links in an attempt to conceptually navigate your way, right, between this concept and this concept. This is a little bit like what was happening in cases of hermetic drift. There's an unlimited semiosis, but unlike the kind of unlimited semiosis that we see in, say, a psychotic state, there is an intentionality to it. People are attempting to get their mind to go to a particular kind of thing by surfing these associations. It's provided that they have the patterns internalized, right? Provided that they sort of have the grid of associations internalized, the tables of correspondence internalized, right? Then it's possible for them to make their way through, to read the world as a text, but more as a researcher, I suppose, than as a pleasure novelist, right? So there's an intentionality to it, this idea to navigate. But there's another really important function that this kind of hermetic drift plays, and that these tables of correspondence play, that I want to touch on, okay? And I want to propose to you that the tables of correspondence, specifically in the doctrines of signatures, constitute themselves a psychotechnology. You have to internalize these very specific associations. In a way, it's not dissimilar to literacy, where with literacy, you have to internalize the shapes of the letters, and you have to internalize sort of the structure of the words and how reading works. And once you do that, you have created a psychotechnological ability to interact with text in order to yield language, right? To sort of impress language onto the world, where language is normally an ephemeral sound-based experience. Similarly, the doctrine of signatures is a kind of systematic, right, impression. You really had to train to get these sort of grids of associations down for the most part. I mean, you pick up some of that stuff culturally, but if you wanted to be serious about it, you were really training to get these sort of grids down in internalized in your system. And yes, of course, there is this ability to navigate via hermetic drift. And there are sort of other psychotechnologies that go along with it. So if you really want to get serious about these kinds of systems, you're typically also picking up Ars Memoria, the arts of memory. So the most famous version of this is undoubtedly the Memory Palace, which has been a bit unrealistically dramatized by the BBC series Sherlock. But in that version, right, he maintains a kind of interior cognitive space where he can access vast amounts of information because he's a TV super genius. However, the actual historical version of the Ars Memoria and the Memory Palace as a technique is pretty well validated. I mean, the basics of it are that you picture a large space that you know very well, and that at sort of each juncture of that space, you picture a unique object, typically something that is a bit absurd or striking in some way, that usefully symbolizes the piece of sequential information that you need to internalize. So this was the kind of technique that was used by sort of pre-literate persons to memorize huge epic poems. And we know that this was the case, that sort of pre-literate peoples nevertheless could have these extremely long, 4,000 line long epic poems that they committed to memory, right? Because that is a power within the oral tradition, this commitment to memory. So the Ars Memoria is an old psychotechnology in its own right for the kind of transmission of information prior to having text and literacy. However, with the doctrine of signatures, we see the Ars Memoria as a psychotechnology and literacy as a psychotechnology get combined to create this new kind of thing. You have to internalize an enormous amount of associative information in this way. But then once you do, yes, you can navigate through that space, and that's useful for reasons where we'll unpack at greater length. But the other reason is you can then use it in yet another psychotechnological fashion, and that is ritual construction. So how does this work? Okay, let's say that you are interested in summoning a love spirit. Okay, that's pretty classic magical work. Humans are, among other things, very often concerned with acquiring wealth and acquiring love, or sex, or both. Okay, so let's say that that this is your specific concern. You want to do something around love. How does this work? Well, we can imagine a case where somebody who had sufficiently well-developed powers of concentration, right, could relatively simply sort of fix their attention in such a way while entering a mild trance, a mild dissociative trance state, right? So that they could potentially separate out this component, right, activate it, focus themselves on it long enough that they could separate it out, that they could have a conversation with it. Something like a very amped up version of chair work, right? Talk to who? The love goddess, right? Okay. However, it's difficult. Why is it difficult? Because developing the kind of focused and continuous and sustained acuity of attention necessary to just be able to do that is hard. So you can use something like the doctrine of signatures, systems of correspondence, tables of correspondence, to create a kind of funnel, a kind of loop. So here's how it works. First, you have to nail all your associations down. So if you were going to do this, you would know, of course, that, right, the love goddess is associated with the planet Venus, is associated with the color green, is associated with red roses, is associated with white oleander as a scent, is associated with the day of the week Friday, is associated, right? You have to have these associations well charted out, right? And you have to have them internalized. Okay. But then when you are going into the state of attempting to make contact with this particular entity, which we're framing here as being a part of oneself, when you're attempting to make contact with this, you furnish your space with all of these different symbolic referents, all of these associated things. You've taken a slice out of the table of correspondence, and you then use all of those different things in the space. So now, yes, you're supposed to be holding your attention onto this task, right? Holding the emotional and conceptual sort of element of love in front of you so that you can do this thing. But let's say your attention strays. Well, if your attention strays to the flowers, they're roses. And so that conceptual transparency loops right back to where you want it to be. Let's say that you get distracted by the smell. Well, it turns out that the smell is white oleander, which is also sacred to that particular goddess. And so your attention loops back around. Or you take in a flash of the green color. Oh, no, loops back around. It's Friday, and so you're thinking about all the great things you're going to do now that it's Friday. Loop back around. The point is that by internalizing this kind of system and internalizing it as a system where if you dial up transparency, all of these things lead back to a central archetypal concept, it allows you to create a ritual space where things that might otherwise be distractions instead become a kind of loop, a kind of amplifier, a kind of funnel that picks up your stray attention and puts it back in the direction. It is in that sense, like many sort of psychotechnologies, a kind of cognitive prosthesis, right? A kind of cognitive prosthesis. It's a loop machine, okay? But you can see how this runs. There's external stuff happening. You're filling your environment with various kinds of external stimuli. The thing is that first you're internalizing a system of reference for those stimuli, right? You internalize the system of references for those stimuli. Now, this is something that we'll unpack at greater length as we go. There is, I guess, one more point that I want to make on this particular front. There's a lot more to talk about in this general field, unfortunately, vastly more than we ever have time for. But there is one more thing that I want to talk about now in this particular field. And this is the idea of the Narathian Bootstrap. Okay, because I want to propose this as part of the general schema in a certain sense for what may be happening in why wizards and saints or magicians and mystics, right? Why those who are pursuing these things might have an interest in these kinds of abilities and altered states as a way of intervening on themselves, right? Now, they may also see that metaphysically as intervening on the world, but for our specific concern, since we're talking about the unconscious as a way of intervening on themselves. So this idea is the Narathian Bootstrap. The Narathian Bootstrap. Okay, so this is an idea that comes from Keith Stanovich, cognitive science Keith Stanovich. And it sort of draws itself from the concept of the ship of Theseus. So if you're familiar with the ship of Theseus, it's, you know, a paradox. It's a classic, right? Classic Greek paradox. And like many Greek paradoxes, it's sort of concerned with futility and eternity and essences, you know, as is often the case. So here it goes, right? The ship of Theseus, you know, sets sail across the Aegean Sea, and en route they have to replace the keel, and then they have to replace the floorboards, and then they have to replace the mast, and then they have to replace the aft castle. I'm running out of boat parts. So they have to replace all these things. And eventually, all of the parts of the ship, right, have been replaced with new wooden parts as it has sustained damage and required repair. And so the classic question is, well, is it the same ship, right? This is the classic question around the ship of Theseus. Is it the same ship? And of course, my way of thinking, it's like, yes, it's the same ship, because the ship is constituted by a stable pattern and not any specific matter. But, you know, you might disagree. However, drawing from the ship of Theseus, the question of the Narathian Bootstrap is the notion, it's a more practical notion. Let's say that we want to replace a part of the ship of Theseus. How do we do it? So let me give you an example, okay? So here, Stanovich is drawing on the work of Otto Neurath, who sort of proposes this problem. How do we do the repairs? So here you are, and you need to repair a board in the deck. You're on the ship of Theseus, and you need to repair a board in the deck. How do you do it, right? Well, the answer is you, of course, have to have firm footing in several other places, and then you can pry the rotten board up and replace it. Makes sense, right? But one of the things that Stanovich points out, and he's talking here about our sort of propositional information, is that it's very hard to figure out which boards of our propositional information, right, the things that we believe the facts that we believe, which boards are rotten and which boards are sound. So this is an example that I often use when I'm talking about sort of epistemological humility, generally speaking. I say, here's the thing. I can go through my beliefs, all my beliefs, and I can look at them one by one, and they will seemingly check out. So I'll think about things that I believe, and I'll be like, yep, that makes sense. Yep, that sounds good. Yep, that seems right. Yep, I'm definitely right about that. Yep. And I can go down the list, and basically anything that it seems that I believe, it seems that I have full justification for believing it. It seems correct. And yet, statistically, it seems highly unlikely to me that I am the only human being on Earth who is right about everything. I mean, I guess it's possible, but it strikes me as unlikely, right? Odds are that, like everybody else I've ever encountered, I am wrong about a significant percentage of things. This is one of the reasons that I, place as much emphasis as I do on holding things lightly and epistemic humility and a kind of like militant agnosticism, is that I don't think it pays to overcommit. I think certainty is a trap for the most part, something we'll talk about at greater length. But the point is, right, that's sort of my response to that. However, I'm nevertheless trapped by this. I can look around and I can see other people, right, who, of course, in some cases do believe that they're right about everything, right, which I find such a bizarre idea. But they believe that they're right about everything, whereas I can see, or can I, that they are demonstrably like wrong about things. So, by the same token, right, I can look at my own beliefs and they all check out. And so how am I supposed to figure out like which boards are rotten, for one thing, and then give myself sort of firm footing to pry them up? And this is the question, right? This is the problem that Otto Neurath posed. So Stanovich proposes this idea of a kind of Narathian bootstrap. Okay, and the idea of the Narathian bootstrap is to give yourself a means by which you can temporarily lift yourself off the deck, in a sense, so that you can pry up rotten boards and replace them on the fly. Right? So this is the practical end. It's the business end of the ship of Theseus. It's like, okay, so let's say we can identify, you can lift yourself off the deck so that you can start prying up rotten boards, right? So it gives you a certain kind of distancing. Okay, so this is the idea, very briefly, of the Narathian bootstrap. Why is any of this relevant to what we're talking about? Okay, so I want to propose to you that in the general scheme that we've been talking about of altered states, okay, and intentional altered states relative to dissociation and the functioning of the conscious and unconscious modules of processing in the mind, that these psychotechnologies operate as Narathian bootstraps, which is to say that they allow you to selectively dissociate, right? Separate things out from your consciousness, operate on those things in various ways, typically, in fact, relationally, right? By negotiation, et cetera. You don't typically enforce yourself on them. You negotiate with them like people, and then reintegrate them back into your system. And that in so doing, right, it allows you that Narathian bootstrap quality. You can lift yourself off the deck. That is what the controlled dissociation altered states in part allow you to do, in order to be able to operate on parts of yourself. And this is not limited, I add, to the propositional. This would include the propositional and the procedural, but most importantly, the perspectival and the participatory, right? So I want to sort of pitch that and have you hold it in your thoughts. That may not be completely clear to you yet. That's fine. This is something we're going to come back to repeatedly, but I want to put this on the table, the idea of the Narathian bootstrap. What we're talking about when we're talking about being able to alter our state in these ways is precisely being able to sort of lift ourselves off the deck, to separate functioning out long enough that we can then act as an operator between things before we reintegrate things back in. Take the part out and like look at it, I guess bargain with it, and then put it back in, okay? So we're going to pick this theme up at, sort of extended length. There is there's sort of an extended version of this that I want to get into. And normally I'm doing this in like 3-hour lectures in class. So I'm trying to compress this material a little bit, but not too much, which is why we're getting it over successive weeks. One of the things I want to talk about is something that I call the Panksepp Pantheon. After the work of Jaak Panksepp and his effective neuroscience. So I want to talk about the way that sort of modules of personification, a bit like what we were talking about with share work, modules of personification, some of these cross-contextual reference systems, et cetera, can combine together with primary effective circuits to yield semi-autonomous or quasi-autonomous or seemingly autonomous agents that are powered by extremely powerful emotional forces that are sort of central to our evolutionary heritage, right? So there are the sort of synthetic emotions that we talked about previously. These are more primary kinds of emotion systems. And one of the things that I want to propose is that very often those emotion systems are tightly correlated to the gods when we see them turn up. And indeed, that our experiences with those things may be about developing a set of psychotechnologies which allows you, right, to communicate with those systems instead of simply having them wash over you in an undifferentiated way. Okay, so to conclude on this section, shamanic practice, among other things, right, the ability to navigate a wide variety of altered states, also in the sort of distributed cognition fashion of leading community, right, and mastery over, sort of different kinds of natural elements. This begins to sort of become differentiated, but there's a lot of overlap and conversation into magic and religion, or mysticism, right, the mystical and the magical, or right, saints and wizards. But there's a broad set of psychotechnologies at work here. Now, some of these, as I mentioned, right, mystical states, they've got their own week, which is why I didn't unpack those at tremendous length here. But I want you to think a little bit about how these axes, right, of transparency, opacity, and construal, right, begin to allow us to chart certain kinds of movements in this space, and why, in fact, that is relevant to certain kinds of practice when we're talking about such things, right? So as I pointed out, right, the ability to sort of navigate through inner associative space is an acquired ability that we have to impose on ourselves, almost like literacy, right? By using other psychotechnology stacked up, literacy, the Ars Memoria, and eventually we get this kind of navigation ability, which combined together with general dissociation, right, the ability to enter kind of meditative trance state, is suddenly allowing you to swim the long paths necessary to talk to something that is separated out for you in some important sense, and possibly in a visionary kind of way. But also it allows you to construct in your environment a kind of system, right, which channels your attention back in order to facilitate the kind of locking in that you need when you are also going into some kind of, meditation and trance state, meditation or trance, right, which can, to a large extent, be auto-hypnotic, right? There is some good reasons to think that auto-hypnosis, hypnosis and auto-hypnosis and trance may actually play a facilitating role in many of the sort of meditative and magical practices. So this is a broad tour. We're going to come back to this again with the material next week, and we will continue to expand our notion, but that was sort of our introduction to the question of saints or wizards.